I think when it comes to finding common ground and coming together to reconcile the things of the past, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a certain religious aspect to the conflict. There are, of course, a significant number of religious minorities within Israel, within Palestine, as well as non-religious people. But most prominently, of course, there's Jews in Israel and there's Muslims in Palestine. So, as with any situation around the world, whether it be based in religion or not, you're going to have radicals and extremists on both sides. And while they tend to be a small number of the actual community, they often make the most noise and take up the most space in conversation. So I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Islamophobia exists to a certain extent in Jewish communities in Israel, and anti-Semitism exists to a certain extent within Palestinian communities. So I would expect the situation that has been the reality there in the past, 80 to 100 years, depending on what year you're going off of. I would expect that kind of situation, unfortunately, raises generations of children on both sides to be fearful and or hold hatred for the other side. And that's what you touched on there. You have this division that says whoever's on the other side of that wall is my enemy, because that's what I've been told and raised to believe. So how much of a problem do you think this kind of, I don't want to use the word indoctrination because it seems to have a really negative, huh? Yeah. Okay. So, on both sides, again, we're coming from an objective point of view as much as I can here. How much of a problem do you think this might be in the context of coming together? How do communities overcome that kind of indoctrination?
Yeah, great question. I think to touch on your point about the radicals making the most noise, that's true, right? But I think what's really important to note is that there's no alternative. There's no alternative vision. So, and usually these radicals, they have a very nationalist, like this very nationalist pride about them, and we speak for the people. So people are gonna like them. People are gonna, because when there's no alternative, because you look at Israel-Palestine, and there is no alternative to the. I mean, there's no there's the alternative, the joint list, 100%. But once again, people are products of their own environments, and people have been brought up to hate. But there's a quote by Nelson Mandela that says that it's much easier for humans to love, because it takes a lot, as I said, to hate, and it's usually rooted in fear, right? So I think for Palestinians as well, it's important to realize that the Jewish state, a lot of their fears are founded in deep existential fears, right? And it's important for us to realize that. I think that it's a problem within our own community, the lack of talk about anti-Semitism, this kind of stuff. It's super important to take into account, because then you start to humanize them and you start to understand why people fear the other, right? I always say, if I was born in Israel, I would be a Zionist, 100%. Why would I not be a Zionist? Like if I was born in let's say like a settlement right outside Gaza, and I had Hamas firing rockets, because I always say that this generation of Israelis, they're very right-leaning and they vote for the Likud, and it's because they've been brought up in the era of the disengagement, the second Intifada, Netanyahu with the wall, and now they're in the army. I'm 19, yeah. I'm not in the army, but a lot of them are in the army now. So it's a tough question, man. But what I like to say is that go to America, for example, and go to America in the time of segregation. To the average Southerner, non-segregation was something that was like, what? Or like to white people in South Africa, apartheid was normal and it was justified, right? Because when you benefit from systems of oppression, it's within your interest to keep those systems of oppression. But when you can offer an alternative vision that doesn't necessarily demonize a whole group, or seek their destruction, I think that you can build a much more sustainable future. Because there is no future without Palestinians in this land, and there is no future without Israelis in this land. And I think that's the first thing that's important to realize, because a lot of Palestinians, especially living outside, think that there's still, some sort of pan-Arab Palestinian state that's going to be from the river to the sea and all this stuff. No, that's not realistic. And you can't create justice by perpetrating another injustice, right? Because I talk to a lot of people on the Palestinian side, and they'll tell me, you need to just kick them out. They need to go back to Europe. And I think that's number one. It's very it's unrealistic. It will never happen in our lifetime. And it's also just problematic. You're not going to kick out 6-7 million people from their homes. As much as, I don't think me or anyone else don't think that they should be living there, you need to acknowledge the reality. I think that's the first step, is to acknowledge the reality and to acknowledge the injustices. And that's another part, because in Israel, for example, you have the Israeli government that actively suppresses information about the Nakba. And the Nakba has shaped our Palestinian identity a lot, right? This feeling, constant feeling of displacement, this constant feeling of, oh, I don't belong, and I can't go back to where I belong. This is something that Palestinians share. It's a collective identity that's built on pain. And so Israeli, the IDF and stuff, they knew that they needed to suppress this information about what happened in 1948 and sort of, paint it as, oh, but the Arab armies invaded, so that's not what happened, right? The Nakba started before. 300,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes before May 15th of 1948. Yeah. You talk about the Deir Yassin massacre, you talk about Lidda, you talk about, all of these injustices that were committed still are not acknowledged by the people who made them. Moshe Dayan, I don't know if that's his name, Ben Gurion, they're celebrated in Israel. For us, they're terrorists.
Yeah.
Right? They killed a lot of our people. And I think that's one part of reconciliation is the historical revisiting of what actually happened, and trying to understand our narratives without necessarily straight up objecting and being, oh, but this and this, because there's a lot to be gained from momentary empathy and listening. It fulfills a deep psychological need, I think, in my opinion, because a lot of times Israelis and Palestinians don't feel like they're being listened to. They feel like they're talking to a wall when they talk to Pali-Peace. And it's because this conflict, or I don't like to call it a conflict, but this situation is so emotionally fueled. It's very hard to think of it logically and to say this and this and that. But that's what in my opinion, that's what I try to do. And I try to, I'm very emotional about this, but I try to see things for what they are and understand why other people think the way that they think, and not necessarily attack their character. Because when you attack someone's character, automatically it shuts them down and they're going to try and defend themselves. So I don't see a point in saying, oh, all Zionists are pigs or all this or all that. I don't think that's very productive.